Police report, July 2nd, 2002. Unclaimed item found in the safe deposit box of U.S. Bank number 4702 in preparation for its demolition. Contents below. My name is Jacob Miller. I guess I should start by setting up the scene. Last year, around the beginning of January, I was laying in bed, trying to get to sleep. It's not that I was tired, I was beat, having just come off a 12-hour shift at the precinct. But for some reason, my mind was alert. The kind of alert where you're in bed and don't remember if you locked the car when you came into the house or the front or back door when you came upstairs to bed. The kind of alert that makes you hypersensitive to any sound as you weigh the effort to get up and set your mind at ease with the fatigue that's already set in. I watched the little red numbers on my alarm clock switch from 10:59 to 11 p.m. I was watching the clock because I told myself that if I was still awake at 11, I would go downstairs and investigate the noise I'd been hearing. It wasn't an out-of-the-ordinary kind of noise. It could have been a dozen mechanical things. The house settling, the dryer cycling, the ice maker grinding, a transformer outside intermittently buzzing, or even just the wind. I was alone in the house because my wife was in Denver for the weekend with work, so whatever it wasn't a result of human activity. I pick up on stuff like this, being a detective. I just spent 6 of the last 8 hours interrogating a suspect we just brought in. It's always more tiring when you get nowhere. I really didn't want to leave my bed, but that sound again. The brain part of me just couldn't get to sleep. I opted to belatedly keep the bed I made with myself. Tossing the covers aside, cold air cut like a knife on my bare legs. Outside, a steady snowfall. I wrapped my house robe around myself as quickly as I could. I opened the bedroom door just a few inches, my ear hovering in the space between it and the wall. I listened. There it was again, as if someone were moving a glass jar across a bench top, about a meter's length. And then it stopped. I waited. A few seconds later, it sounded again. I crept entirely out of my bedroom and made my way down the carpeted steps toward the sound, which I discerned through the darkness was in the kitchen. I passed through the dining room and pressed with the tips of my fingers the door jamb leading into the kitchen. Though the room was dimly lit, I could easily make out a human figure looking into the open fridge. I jumped a little from the shock, then asked, "Carly?" I breathed a sigh of relief. My wife turned around quickly, closing the fridge door. "You scared the hell out of me. You're back from Denver?" "Surprise," she said softly. I let my guard down entirely, leaning against the door jamb, hands in the pockets of my robe. She had removed mayo, cold meats, and lettuce from the fridge and was making herself a sandwich. I could only just make out what she was doing from the moonlight seeping in through the kitchen window above the sink. "It's late," I said. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," she whispered, spreading some mustard onto 2 slices of bread. I smiled. She'd grabbed, in her decision to remain in the dark, the whole grain. It was the mustard jar I'd been hearing. Glass sliding across the countertop. We were divided by the long kitchen island. Carly was on the side closest to the fridge, condiments fanned out on the bench for easy use. I took a seat on one of the bar stools at the island, wrapping my house robe tighter around my body. "Go back to bed," she whispered, ushering towards the stairs with the butter knife. I just mumbled, rubbing my eyes. My attention returned to Carly. She'd taken a bite. The sound of the lettuce crunching in her mouth made mine water. I got off the stool and walked slowly to the opposite side of the room, the side where I had entered, intending to turn on the light. When I got to the switch, I heard her voice whisper, "Leave it off." Then another crunch of the sandwich. What? Something wasn't right. "You want me to leave it off?" I asked. "Leave it off," she repeated in an even lower whisper. I must have still been waking up because the voice I heard at that moment sounded even less like her voice. I turned around to face Carly, surveying the room in the low light. Obviously, we were alone. It could have only been her voice, and she was halfway through her sandwich, munching away. Huh? I asked her for confirmation a second time, whispering, facing her completely now. Leave it off, she repeated. The cadence of her voice was stifled with that sandwich in her mouth. I'd lost, at this point, any further thought of my own appetite. That was when a wave of heat peeled onto my body from bottom to top. Perplexed isn't the word I was feeling. In this moment, I began noticing other things that were off about Carly. She seemed different somehow. Scared. Not her, it was me. I was starting to feel scared. Why? I forced a laugh, taking a step toward her. As soon as I did this, she took a corresponding step back, right up against the counter next to the fridge. She stopped chewing, and the kitchen was dead silent. Was she scared of me? Like we were just meeting for the first time in that small space of a kitchen? I was confused. All of her movements, a mirror image of Carly's, yet not Carly. The woman in my kitchen was not my wife. My mind began to race. Nearest exit, back door directly ahead of me, past the fridge, past her. Closest gun, one room over, living room, on top of the china cabinet. Maybe I could just take her down, call for backup. Was this woman armed? Not that I could see. The closest item in her reach was the blunt butter knife. Where was my wife? Hopefully still in Denver, I reminded myself. I wasn't speaking. I needed to say something. I couldn't see the woman's face, but I felt she was staring at me. Well, I was going to join in with the sandwich party, but you're probably right. I should get back to bed. I was working a guy at the station all day. He wouldn't crack. I added the last detail about my day because I had texted Carly about it earlier that day, driving home, and I wanted to see what the woman in my kitchen would say. She took the last bite of her sandwich. I froze for another split second. Had I given away my identity as a cop? Would she see me as more of a threat? A murder, huh? She asked, getting out more bread. Who was this woman? I specifically remembered texting Carly that I had clocked over 6 hours with this guy in a murder interrogation. She joked that in dog years it would have been a couple of days. I began to sweat as she finished making a second sandwich. Why a second sandwich? The mustard jar moving again. That was the scraping sound. All her movements replaying like a tape on a loop. Nearest to exit, closest gun. Was this woman a threat? See you upstairs, hon? I rubbed my eyes and tried to leave the room at a calm pace. Yes, she responded, almost a hiss. She watched me, chewing and swallowing another bite of sandwich. I didn't know how to place that next feeling I had, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone is paying attention to you. Not just being watched like at a party, but being focused on, like you're the person's next move. I caught that in her yes. Like a change of direction from the loop she was in. Like an invitation that had just been accepted. My plan in that moment was to get the gun on top of the china cabinet in the dining room. But as I brushed past the light switch, I changed the plan. I flicked the light on and spun around towards the woman, pushing myself up against the island. I froze. The woman squinted from the light. I had to blink a few times to adjust my eyes. What I was seeing was horrifically inexplicable. Recalling it now, I feel so utterly conflicted, unable to reconcile that night. What I saw. My wife was not my wife at all. At first I had thought she was. Carly's eyes, Carly's big lips, Carly's thin eyebrows. But her face was all wrong. It was wider, like the way a photo will squash features, and her eyes seemed a different kind of green, like what false lighting will do to an exposure. Her hairline, the widow's peak in the part, was backwards. What terrified me was not that this woman was not my wife, but rather that she looked nearly identical. A mirror, not a mirror, a photo image. And she seemed to be making herself at home, in my home. I hadn't said anything in seconds. I was shaking, watching her. The woman put down the sandwich and dipped her head to her shoulder, like a mother disappointed in her son. "You'll have a harder time falling asleep now," she said, almost gently. And hearing her voice, watching it come out of her lips, I thought, God, it is so close to Carly's. I was almost hypnotized, trying to process the minute differences between the two women. The curiosity was paralyzing. I reminded myself that something was not right here and that I needed to respond. I snapped myself out of the trance and ran to the next room. On my tiptoes, I felt around on the top of the cabinet until my fingers grazed a pistol I'd hidden just months ago, as was Carly's suggestion. I gripped the gun firmly and spun around fast, aiming it defensively. The woman had not followed me into the dining room. I crept towards the kitchen, intending to make her leave my house as quickly as possible. But when I returned, the kitchen was empty. Not only that, there was no trace that she had ever been there. No condiments on the counter. No crumbs visible on the island. I walked purposefully to the fridge, my gun held out behind me in my blind spot, and opened the door. The mayonnaise, turkey, and bread were all in their proper place. I spun around, again aiming the gun at no one. What is happening? Suddenly I heard footsteps above me. I looked up, trying to place them exactly. She's in my bedroom. This woman moved impossibly fast. I didn't even hear her go upstairs. I forced myself to stop calculating and began to creep towards the staircase. I have to call for backup, and then I have to arrest this woman, I thought. My cell phone was charging on the desk in my bedroom, in a corner next to my bed. Our house landline was in the bedroom also. My only way to communicate with the precinct was through that phone, unless I fled the house, but it was close to midnight now. No neighbor would be up, and my keys were also upstairs on the dresser. It's my house, I thought. I have a gun. I can defend this place. The soft carpet padded my careful footsteps, although the stairs still creaked under my feet. I kept my gun up and my eyes open. The light coming from my bedroom suddenly turned off, and it was pitch black again. I felt another wave of heat and fear. Arriving at the top of the stairs, I turned on the hall light. It showed me that my bedroom door was, although closed, not shut all the way. I swallowed a huge lump in my throat and with one hand pushed the bedroom door wide open. The master bedroom was large, so the light spilling in from the hallway didn't light up the entire room, but it was enough for me to see where this woman was in my room. This woman who was pretending to belong in my home, who had made a late-night snack in my kitchen and conversed with me like we were husband and wife, was now laying in my bed under the covers. I ran a shaky hand over my face, down to my beard, and involuntarily let out a soft sound. With my free hand, I felt around on the wall for the bedroom light switch and turned it on. The woman was now a clear lump under the covers, but the lump was much larger than the size of her, and big enough for two people. Her hair was blacker than night, much darker than Carly's, I was now realizing in the fullness of the bedroom lights. How had she fooled me? "Get out of the bed," I commanded, my gun held high. What happened next? I went into shock. This is the part I replay in my mind the most. The woman threw the bed covers off of herself and sat up as if she were floating or being pulled toward me by something. Her eyes were so angry that they seemed like completely black holes, and her entire body seemed to grow larger as she grew closer. When I think back, I wonder if it were a different woman altogether from the one I'd seen in the kitchen, but her clothes were the same. She'd laid down in her clothes, and her face was absolutely not the face of my wife. Black hair, frizzed haphazardly, glassy, pale skin as if she were wet from rain that hadn't fallen in weeks. It was like she was mad at me for ruining the game where I pretend she's my wife. As soon as she sat up, she lifted her right arm and stretched it out completely, pointed her index finger towards me, and growled, "Leave it off!" Leaving the bed entirely, she came toward me. I thought she was going to leap on me. I should have shot, but I didn't. I've never, in 10 years, frozen up like that. I hardly believed what I was experiencing was reality. I backed up into the hallway, but instead of following me, she came as far as she needed to for her index finger to be in reach of the light switch and turn it off. She was still visible from the hallway lights, and she seemed to tower over me. The small woman I'd earlier made her out to be was now large and bear-like with an awful face, a disfigurement of Carly, not changing her expression even for a moment. I began to cower. I curled up into a ball against the stair rail and started to rock myself. If the stair rail had broken at that moment, I would have fallen. There are 2 more details I need to tell you. Both details I hadn't noticed until this point, until she was standing over me. The first is a detail the police cannot explain. This woman somehow was wearing an almost identical outfit to one my wife owned. A striped black and white sweater that I remember Carly wearing when she left the house the day before to get on the flight to Denver. Except the stripes were facing the wrong way, like a poorly made knockoff. She was also wearing similar slacks. Even her coat was a copy of Carly's winter coat, puffy and black, yet Carly's, I remember, was 15 inches or so shorter than the one this woman was wearing. She didn't take it off when she climbed back into our bed. I could hear it rubbing against the covers as she settled, once again, like a bear settling into hibernate. "Carly," I tried to whisper, but I hardly made any sound, just the shape of my mouth miming my wife's name in time to the rush of the snow-driven wind against my bedroom window. Hearing the world outside urged me to get up and get out. Did I really have to go back into that room to dial 911 and wait for the police to come? I couldn't. The thought of her, that long finger pointing at me accusingly, the spit coming down her chin, I wouldn't. So I crawled down the stairs, hands first, until I got the strength to get to my feet. I opened the front door and tore out of there. I ran a block to a friend's house. After banging on the door for what seemed like too long, I saw Sean, who appeared, half asleep, to let me in. He called the police and then Carly, but couldn't get a hold of her. Her flight home was scheduled for early morning. The police arrived and found nothing out of the ordinary in my home. The next morning, my wife flew back as scheduled. After a more thorough search, no evidence was found. No used cutlery, no fingerprints on the fridge, no DNA in the mayonnaise. The only sets of prints they could find were mine and Carly's, like nothing had happened. I'd be lying if I didn't say my life changed after this event. I changed. I became a different person. Police leave the force after seeing much more horrific things, but this was something I couldn't seem to shake. Maybe if I hadn't gotten such a close look at her, maybe if I hadn't gone back upstairs, then perhaps at night, laying in bed next to Carly, I wouldn't still see this woman's face when I looked at my wife. I left the force, and I tried to make things right with Carly. One day, a couple of months after it all happened, she stood in the door of the bathroom while I was shaving, looking at me through the mirror, and said, "You don't look at me anymore, Jake." She was right. I couldn't even look at her in that moment. The mirror. We separated shortly after that. I've retained my gun license since I left the force. I carry it on me at all times. I've gone through every single photo I have of Carly, trying to find an image that looks like her imposter. There is one photo, Carly with a mouthful of food. It's the closest image I have. I know it's not the same woman, but the similarities are uncanny. I'm writing this down as my witness statement for the record in case something happens to me, or if this woman ever resurfaces. This woman who ruined my job, my marriage, my life. If I ever see this woman again, I won't freeze up like before. I know what to expect now. I won't cower. I will kill her.